We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets. Welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Chris McCurry.
And I'm Emma Waddington. And today we have two fabulous guests. Firstly, we have Robert Bordone, or Bob, as is known to many. Bob is a nationally recognized expert in conflict resolution, negotiation, dialogue, and difficult conversations. He spent 2 decades on the faculty at Harvard Law School, where he founded and directed the Harvard Negotiation and Mediation Clinical Program. Bob's work is all about building bridges in divided times. He's advised governments, corporations, religious communities, and individuals, helping people navigate some of their most stuck and painful conflicts with greater clarity, humanity, and hope. He's also author of the recent book, Conflict Resilience, which explores how we can face conflict, not with fear or avoidance, but with the skills and emotional strength to go through it. It's a powerful and timely guide for anyone who wants to engage with more constructively with the inevitable tensions of life, whether in our families, workplace, or the wider world. I'm so delighted to welcome Bob to Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
And we also have Joel Salinas. He is the co-author of Conflict Resilience, Negotiating Disagreement Without Giving Up or Giving In. And he is the chief medical officer and co-founder of Isaac Health and is an associate professor of neurology at NYU Grossman School of Medicine. He practices general neurology with a subspecialty in behavioral neurology and neuropsychiatry. Prior to NYU, he was an assistant professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School and the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. He is also a clinician scientist with the Framingham Study at the Boston University School of Medicine. Welcome to you both. We are so delighted to have you here to talk about conflict resilience, which is a turn of phrase that I have never heard before, and I'm very excited about getting into it and talking about a conflict which is so much on the minds of people today. You can't turn on the news, pick up a newspaper without running into conflict. And we are in so need of ways of handling these situations. And so I know you're going to shed some great light on that. So tell me what brought you to this idea of conflict resilience as opposed to conflict resolution. And I can't even say conflict resilience without automatically saying conflict resolutions because it's so ingrained as part of our culture. And this is what we're hoping to shift today. So please tell us about your journey and how you got to this point.
Sure. Well, I love the fact that you keep on saying conflict resolution first, mostly because, my whole professional career really has been on conflict resolution. And then I would say beginning about a decade ago, I was teaching at Harvard Law School, teaching negotiation, teaching mediation, teaching conflict management and resolution skills. And part of what I started to notice was a meaningful shift in the kinds of conversations that were going on, not just in my classes, but also reported by others of my colleagues, that classes that were interesting because people brought diverse and different political views into the room, or just different ways of thinking about the law, were becoming dull and boring because people were just being quiet or kind of coalescing around what I might call a moderate, slightly left of center viewpoint. And it occurred to me that part of what was happening was that even if we gave people skills of conflict resolution, you can only resolve, or you can only negotiate, or you could only mediate or problem solve if you actually had a capability or a sensibility to sit in the discomfort of the disagreement, of the conflict. And so in 2018, I was asked to give a talk at a conference called PopTech. And the way I opened the talk is I said, I've been teaching conflict resolution for 20 years, but that's not what I'm going to talk to you about. I'm going to talk to you about something different, and it's called conflict resilience. And so it was really this idea of, which is in some sense is not that complex, although what becomes fun, and at least fun for me and hopefully for Joelle, my co-author, is there's a lot of brain science and a lot of research that we can bring to bear on this. But at some simple level, right, conflict resilience is really just the mindset, the capacity to sit with the discomfort of our disagreements in ways that are authentic and non-avoidant, but also that have a real capacity for empathy and curiosity for the other. And our kind of premise or idea is that quality is fundamental to leadership. It's fundamental to being able to be a fully kind of in relationship person. And it is under serious threat right now, I think, in our culture and society.
Hey, listeners, we're Emma
and Chris,
and we're excited to share our new children workbooks. Just in Case Sits with Anxiety follows Justin on his first babysitting job and a case of the what ifs. The Glum twins unhooked from sadness tells the story of Dolores and Tristan as birthday plans go off the rails.
Both books are designed for kids ages 8 to 12 and are packed with playful, hands-on activities based on acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. They help kids understand that emotions like anxiety and sadness are totally normal, and that we don't have to let them stop us from doing what matters. Each book also includes a special section for parents and caregivers on how to support kids through tough emotional moments. They're fun, evidence-based, and full of heart.
Know a kid facing tough feelings of anxiety or sadness? These books are for them. Available now in bookstores and online. Thank you all for your support.
I'll add to that. And the way that I came to this, a lot of the work that I've been doing leading up to when I first started talking about it with Bob was looking at psychosocial determinants of brain health, so really understanding how our social relationships and social environments influence our health, in particular our neurological health. And one of the things that was really striking to me was that social isolation and loneliness are these factors that have pretty significant toll on our health. The risk of mortality for people that are lonely is just as high as those that are obese or are smokers. And loneliness is on the rise, and so is social isolation. And part of me was wondering, what interventions are there that we can bring into this? What is it about our society that makes it harder for us to connect with each other? And I think in conversation with Bob, I think it just really made sense that without conflict, there is no connection. And trying to sort through what's possible, I thought it was a really great way to blend together the tools of what Bob's been working on with what we know about neuroscience, psychology, human behavior, and really put something together that helps us to get at the core of what we think is the issue. Is, certainly techniques and tactics are important, scripts are important, just like recipes and tools for cooking are important, but if you can't stand the heat of the kitchen, there's no way you'll ever be able to use or do any of that. And so we're trying to really argue here is let's increase our ability to be in the heat of that kitchen and the heat of conflict, so that way we can deploy with all these other tools and techniques, so that way we can better navigate these really, really sticky situations that happen all the time.
I love this conversation, especially I was struck when I heard about your book and your work, because I'm a couples therapist. Well, I'm a clinical psychologist, I do. But this is like the cornerstone of couples therapy. And actually the cornerstone of any relationship is conflict. Like you say, conflict is as common as, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We have it all the time. And yet, like you talk about in the book, our default with conflict is either you have the 5 Fs, to avoid or to fester or to go in too hard. And so we're not very skilled at conflict and we don't do it very often. And I was wondering if what you were saying, Bob, is that you're seeing that we're getting worse at it, that you think that we're actually getting worse at doing conflict, or that conflict isn't something that we're as comfortable. What is it that you were talking about your sort of work at the
Yeah. I mean, what
Harvard?
I would
But that's
say is that we are getting less capable and willing to engage conflict, period. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. So I can kind of give you a very kind of specific observation of this in, I would say, American higher education, which is that I think beginning in I would say about a decade ago, if you're in a more polarized place where you think that it's less likely that if we actually have a conversation, we're going to find any common ground anyway. Right? Because much of the drive of, I would say, a lot of at least American higher education, certainly in law or in business school or in schools of professional, like public policy, is we want to have a problem-solving orientation. But you only have a problem-solving orientation if you think the other side, that there's something there that you could solve together. But polarization makes it seem like actually they're just crazy. They're just unhinged. They're unreasonable. They think the earth is flat. So why would we exactly have a conversation with them? That's a waste of our time. Moreover, the more polarized we become, the higher the cost of engaging a conflict constructively, because when you do that, your side sees it as betrayal. And we could see this certainly in the American political context. I mean, if you look at two of the most conservative Congress people on just traditional politics, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. These are extremely conservative people, but simply sitting on a committee with Democrats have made them kryptonite in their party. So what I was observing is this: there's no point. There's no point in engaging with the other. It's extremely uncomfortable. I'm going to be seen as a traitor to my own side. And then add one more kind of poisonous thing to the recipe. It's social media. It's so easy to cultivate these cocoons of comfort. The people who think like us, who say things we agree with, right? And if we put something up on Twitter and somebody puts a hate comment, all of our friends will suddenly come to protect us. But most of the time, the algorithm is just getting rid of those people. So I guess my observation, just Emma, was that for a whole bunch of reasons, these 5 Fs, right, particularly kind of the flight mode, just became easier. And there didn't seem to be a lot of an upside to doing the work. And then add to that one thing that I think has always been in play. I don't think this is new, which is that we tend to, in our culture, see conflict as a negative. And I think what Joelle said, earlier, just is highly resonant for us, which is without conflict, we don't actually have connection. Like, it is the conflict, it is the power of the first no in a relationship that makes all the other yeses real. And we need to have that. But I think all of those things were coming together in a way that I think was different than circa 2005.
Yeah. Everything's gotten amplified.
Yeah. And it is kind of ironic, isn't it? That if you can't hang out together, like you were saying, Joelle, right? If we can't have these conversations because the fear of it getting explosive and nuclear is too high, then we can't connect and we can't find, deeper friendships. But what you're saying, Bob, is that this desire to become more tribalistic feels like we're creating more connections, but we're not.
Well, and what happens is if you're in that tribe and you say the wrong thing, you're done. So that's the sign that it isn't real connection. It's a false connection. And there was a piece that was written that had in the New York Times shortly after our book came out that referenced our book. Joelle and I were very delighted by this and surprised, not because it referenced our book so much, but mostly because it was a very heady piece. And we think our book is very usable and practical and not overly heady. But it talked about the importance of this idea of solidarity in political movements. And that solidarity was different from unanimity. Solidarity was we have a shared set of values, but your strategy, Emma, might be different from yours, Chris, might be different from yours, Joelle. And that we need to be able to support each other in those different strategies. But that a shift that we have seen is that even if we have the same political values, if you don't do it my way, you're out. And that's not conflict resilience. That's something else, right? But it's not conflict resilience.
I mean, this reminds me so much of, as a child psychologist, mostly a parent psychologist, working with parents, both in terms of the conflicts they were having typically with their adolescents, but also the conflicts between parents around parenting itself. And it was often not a values conflict. It was often a strategies, techniques, and that would be the thing I'd have to work at is, okay, we can all agree that your child needs to be respectful to adults. How are we going to get them to do that? One parent wants to beat him, the other parent wants to give him candy, whatever, extreme examples. But it was at the level of strategy that the conflicts existed, which could be worked out. But the resilience piece is so near and dear to my heart. And my favorite definition of resilience is struggling well, which is something I used to tell parents all the time, that you're struggling, but you're struggling well.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. Yeah, yeah. No, I think there's very little place for that, at least and I don't think it's just, I've centered this a little bit more on politics, and maybe because the question was, where did the idea originate from? But, I think that was also part of the connection with Joelle, which is that it is it shows up in, reports around mental health and well-being, right? And in families. And I think one of the really interesting things, you're catching us now, our book has been out for, a few months, not long, but a few months. So we've given public talks, and I can't tell you afterwards how many times people come up to me with a searing family story. I got an email today from somebody who was at one of my talks, and she said, I was wondering if we could schedule some time. My son's wedding is June 7th, and I'm not invited, and I don't know what to do. And so and there's something just somehow this kind of felt need, I think, has really struck me, at least, a lot, and in ways that have been eye-opening. We wanted the book to be for everybody, but I will say, the genesis of it for me was these kind of just my own observations, teaching conflict resolution. Just a lot.
I love that in the book you talk about without conflict resilience, we can't even get to resolution, and I think that is a fabulous reframe. I'm looking at from the backdrop of my couples work, is that, it feels so novel to think that conflict is such a cornerstone to connection. Like you're saying, it seems like it's a contradiction. And most people come into conflict thinking this is going to get in the way of my relationship. This is not where we build our relationship. And one of the first steps I need to do with couples is get them to a place where they recognize that both perspectives matter. And just because they've got two sometimes very different perspectives, like Chris was saying, the parents, doesn't mean that they have to work really hard to persuade the other one that they're wrong in order to feel heard. And like you say in the book, one of the sort of core human needs, be it in, the boardroom, in the kitchen, or, in a restaurant, is to feel heard. And often we approach conflict with, I cannot let them say their piece because otherwise that undermines, like you were saying, Bob, it undermines me, or I might have to start agreeing with them, or it makes me weak. And that immediately puts people on the back foot because they're not feeling heard. And then the conflict sort of escalates. So for me, reading your work and listening to your work, it feels so critical as a skill that I see in the therapy room, but absolutely that we need in general. And yet it is so difficult and something that, like Joelle, you've said, we should be teaching in schools. I'm a big advocate for teaching what you describe as conflict resilience, this ability to be good at sitting with the discomfort of somebody else's perspective. And yes, so I'm so glad that we're having this conversation because it's much needed, but something that, like you're saying, Bob, that people really, really struggle with, from, their relationship with their kids to, working in more diverse communities means that you have lots of different opinions, and some of them you've never heard before and you don't know what to do with. And so we need to get better at sitting with this discomfort of what conflict brings. And I wonder if it would be useful for our listeners to think about why those 5 F's that you described so nicely
Can we
in the
repeat
book.
those?
Perhaps,
Yeah.
Joelle, you can talk to the neuroscience because it's so good.
Yeah, I mean, and I think just to your point about kind of the importance to teach these things, there's this socio-emotional learning element that is just really critical, because there's a void, really, and this does kind of relate to like what's going on in our brains. So when we talk about the 5 F's, it's the fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and fester. So there's different default reactions that people can have in response to conflict. And there can be many more F's, but we just wanted to kind of give the highlights of like the more common ones that we see. But generally, this default reaction is what your brain has essentially learned as a reflex in response to the discomfort, the negative charge of conflict or potential conflict situations. Our brains, as they evolve, is really just a fortune-telling machine. It's hundreds of billions of neurons with hundreds of trillions of connections, all there to really help to take past experiences, build memories, and then make predictions about what's going to happen, so that way you can take actions to help to increase your likelihood of survival and hopefully thrive as well. But it's like the whole kind of like Neanderthal hearing a rustling of the leaves in a bush. You'll be more likely to survive if you anticipate that it's a saber-toothed tiger in the bush than nothing. And so this mechanism that we have of making predictions of what's going to happen gets programmed through all of our experiences through our lives. And oftentimes our earliest experiences of conflict, as a child, there's seeing our parents engage with conflict, seeing kind of how we relate with kind of siblings or friends or in school, or what we see on TV. And what we learn from those conflicts can be quite negative, where we kind of can see conflict as a sign of something's wrong. There's a failure, a sign of danger, a threat. And it's that kind of associating of potential conflict with that negative feeling, that these valence systems in our brain that let us know how negatively charged something is, that again, it gets hardwired in there. There's another part of our brain that's the salient systems that let us know how much to pay attention to something, right? And what happens is, in these conflict situations, the potential conflict situations where that negative feeling reaches a certain threshold, our brain will just set off an alarm. And that alarm then triggers a whole cascade of reactions in our brain that is kind of releasing all these hormones like epinephrine, which then makes our heart rate increase, our blood pressure go up, our muscles contract, our respiratory rate tends to quicken. And then our thought processes tend to move away from these frontal-parietal systems, which are really important for deliberative thinking and self-regulation, and more to these kind of limbic and paralimbic systems that are there to really help to drive quick reactions. And so what we're really advocating for is kind of to break that cycle, those kind of behavioral loops, as much as possible. And the first thing in that process is awareness. Awareness is more than half the battle with this. If you take anything from the book, it's having an awareness towards your your own reaction and response to conflicts around you. If your listeners just cue themselves in and pay close attention to how they're responding to conflict situations with a coworker or with a parent or a sibling or a child, and paying attention to what are those situations where that alarm is going off more than others, can give you a lot of information about your what is that wiring in your brain that you potentially have to reprogram and kind of unlearn for yourself, so that way you can sit with it a little bit more mindfully in a way where you're more likely to get this deliberative kind of part of your brain to engage a lot more. So that way, instead of reacting to the situation, you're more likely to have a response that's better aligned with what you really want to get out of that exchange.
I mean, I know that there's research out there, you're undoubtedly more familiar with it than I am, where just naming an emotion begins to reconnect the frontal system with the back end and starts down-regulating the fight or flight response, the 5Fs. And, that's what I've always tried to teach the kids, is like naming the emotion and with some subtlety, because there's a difference between being frustrated and being angry, that sort of thing. But between the naming and then just being curious, like, what's going on? Why am I feeling this way right now?
There's some really great work looking at just like emotional vocabulary and how with like kids, if you just teach them, like the more extensive their emotional vocabulary is, the greater the long-term outcomes they have. And part of that is that naming to taming phenomenon. It's also just articulating kind of your feeling, which just makes it much more likely that you're engaging that frontal parietal system to be much more deliberate in your responses.
Right. And then you can communicate better. You can tell somebody I'm frustrated, which is, a different message than I'm angry.
Yeah.
And, I love teaching kids the word indignant.
Yeah.
They have a lot of fun with that one. But yeah, the idea, and I think, yes, go ahead, Bob.
No, there's this exercise that we sometimes use called the emotional footprint. And it's really just to help people think about what are the emotions that are easier or harder for them to both feel, express, and receive, because those are three different things. And it's funny because the first few times I did this, which was years ago, I would find that the exercise would be done very quickly for some people and not for others, because some people would have they come up with 5 emotions and it'd be done. And so since then, what I've done is I now have a slide that has probably 60 emotions on it. And I'll put that up and I'll say, for those of you who could only really think about 5, here's a whole list to help you think it through. Because there's just something about being able to name the nuance, right? And I think in a lot of the work that I do sometimes, so I think that emotions can be also very gender coded in terms of what is okay to feel or not feel or express and not express. Not just gender, of course, it's also cultural and, and even generational. I think younger people are more feeling it's okay to express being proud. And an older generation could see that sometimes as you're being braggadocious. But the kind of the ability of that nuance of the emotion, a lot of times when I'm working with guys, they're allowed to be frustrated. But they can't be sad, worried, anxious, even though that often goes along with frustrated, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Let alone humiliated.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I know you have a 3-step process: naming, exploring, and committing. But Emma, you were starting to say something. I interrupted.
Well, I was sorry. I think absolutely we probably want to start talking about that. And as we know, I sometimes get too excited about a certain corner of our conversation. But I love this part around, being better, being more emotionally literate, that kind of having that vocabulary, that nuance is so important for us to be able to express ourselves. But even before that, Joelle, I was thinking with what you were saying, we need to have, or at least I find with my work, but even with my kids, I need to give them a really strong rationale why it's worth sitting with these feelings, why it's worth sitting with conflict. There needs to be a buy-in, because there is such a reluctance. So I was wondering, I mean, the buy-in with couples therapy is, well, partly, do you think this is working, what you guys are doing? Probably not. That's why you're here. But,
Sure.
so that's a fairly obvious one. But how do you give people a strong rationale for sitting with this? Because it does feel so
Yeah.
uncomfortable sometimes.
I mean, that is just really critical to be able to align so much of your brain to even want to sit through the discomfort. And so, at a very basic level, we recommend that people always think about the purpose behind the dialogue. Like, why is it that you want to engage in this conversation? Why is this relationship important to you? Why are you sitting in the same room, or like, why are you at work? So like these reasons that are like why, but there's a specific concept that that we introduce that's informed a lot of the work of Judd Brewer, who's a psychiatrist out of Stanford, and it's the BBO, the bigger, better offer, which is a really great way to kind of break that behavioral loop. And so the idea of the bigger, better offer is to, after you become aware of your behavioral patterns or behavioral loops, really thinking about how that behavior changed, how like spending some more time on that conflict as opposed to avoiding or kind of fighting or fawning or festering. What will you get out of it by doing that? Like, what is the bigger, better situation, and really visualizing it and making it as vivid as possible. And part of why that works is that there's part of our brain called the orbital frontal cortex that sits like just behind our eyes up here. And it's one of the things that it does is it helps to kind of set kind of, I want to say price tags, kind of just like what is the amount of positivity from the behavior and the amount of negativity from it, and the amount of reward you'll get from it. And the more you can kind of increase the value of that better behavior, the more your whole brain starts to bring all of its dopamine pathways, the reward and reinforcement pathways towards that new behavior. And so if you can think about, let's say asking for a raise, right? Very scary for some people. If you can really focus so much on, if I ask for a raise, I can get a promotion, I'll have a better sense of mastery, I'll be able to have more independence in my work, I'll be able to have a lot more financial security. And the more you really kind of color that in for yourself, the more you'll see that as an opportunity rather than this like really threatening, like very scary situation. And it may still be scary, but the potential reward ends up being so much greater than the scariness of it.
In ACT, we call those augmentals.
There you go.
Yeah.
I think what's, part of, in some interesting way to me, right, part of this is actually, I think, a very hard part of certain aspects of the work that I'm really interested in around polarization. And I think it goes back to this shift from an orientation that began in most professional schools in the United States in the late 90s toward problem solving, right? Away from doctrine and toward problem solving. And then fast forward 15 years later, when people feel like these other people, these are not people I can work with. There's nothing to work with here. So there is no bigger, better offer. The thing I ought to do instead is try to vanquish them. That's what I should do. Either that or create a cocoon of distance where I never have to deal with them, except maybe at Thanksgiving, and I'll hold my breath. And then I have to see them again. And of course, you can't run a company or a family or certainly a country that way. Because if we can't engage around these issues where we do have differences in order to problem solve in some constructive way, then we're not going to solve anything, right? And I think that shift, that loss of the BBO, I think it requires some work. Like I find in my work that I have to spend a non-trivial amount of time demonstrating to people that it's valuable. And perhaps one of the upsides of, or hopefully maybe I'm making this up, but like your profession is that hopefully the couple is showing up because they want to work on it. Although I'm imagining that at least sometimes only one of them feels that way and the other doesn't see it. And I'm imagining that at least sometimes that people are saying, well, just do it to me, like solve the problem, right? Like we hope, right, our book is extremely useful and powerful But here's the way probably Joelle would be mad at me because this is not a sales pitch. The book doesn't do anything to you. Like, it's an invitation to hard work.
I do disagree actually on that point. And I think this is just like a fundamental fact of life. You're right that it doesn't, like, the book in of itself will not kind of like pick you up and like reprogram you. You have to put in the work, but in that doing the work, your brain is changing. And that's kind of like core to plasticity of the brain, right? Your brain is rewiring, reprogramming itself. And at the end of engaging with this topic, and the more you engage with it, your brain will be very different. You will be a different person at the end of it. You will be transformed in a way that you might not have expected. And that is at a very cellular neurotransmitter level that'll help you to better regulate your own experiences and to be better orient kind of your attention and your awareness when you are encountering conflicts.
Yeah, I agree with all that, except I don't think the reading of the book will do it.
Yeah, you have to work.
You have to do something else besides the reading of the book.
It's like reading about working out doesn't give you a big bite.
Yeah, exactly. It's like reading the recipe, is like great, but like you won't get the French meal out of that.
Yes.
And you have to be able to stand the heat in the kitchen.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Well, as these are skills, and you do initially have to do a lot of overriding of the initial, reactions that show up. And in my experience, both as a human being and from the work that I've done, is the old program and the old wiring doesn't really go anywhere. It's just overridden. And under the right circumstances, that old stuff can be activated. So people shouldn't despair if they're, doing so well with, training up their ability to, be resilient around conflict. And then one day, for a variety of reasons, they just can't do it. It's not a setback. It's, got to keep at it.
I mean, one of the things I often say, right, because I will sometimes encounter a fair amount of resistance to some of these new behaviors for all sorts of reasons. It feels uncomfortable. It seems awkward. Certainly when you're learning them, it can feel somewhat stilted and not, this is not the way I talk or whatever. Agreed. And one of the things I always say, though, is that at some level, right, the set of responses and skills that you already do have been quite successful. It's gotten to you to whatever, maybe the 15th year in your marriage, maybe to being the vice chair of your department, maybe it's to whatever it is. And there's something that they're not serving right now, and you need to build out more repertoire. And so this is kind of how do we expand this out and build out some more repertoire, because whatever, the 5 Fs aren't working in these situations, so that it doesn't have to feel just like there's something wrong with a set of approaches that have gotten to me wherever I am, reasonably decently, at least.
No, I mean, that's a great way to assure people that by making changes in what you're doing doesn't mean that everything you've done up to this point is wrong, because that is a real stumbling block for a lot of people. We see it all the time in therapy.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah. So to me, that is like such a key piece. I mean, I think for me, part of what has been fun about the book and this work is like a lot of the work that I often have done is like getting a sense of people can access skills, at least the people I work with, relatively easily. They just can't access the skills in the context as themselves when they need them.
Right.
Right. And figuring out that puzzle seems more valuable to me than just giving here are the words. And I think it is important to give the words, because sometimes people don't know how to phrase it, or they haven't seen a good example of it. I mean, going back to your earlier question, Emma, about like the evolution of this, right? I think we have fewer really good examples of people disagreeing well.
And we have some examples of, like you said, of people currently who are not using any of these skills and who are quite successful. and I put air quotes in as much as, successful to all relative to what we think. But there are plenty of people, like when I bring this up, who will go, I don't need to do this. This works really well. I could just tell people what to do. I don't have to agree. And you mentioned psychological safety, which is a big term at the moment in a lot of corporates that I'm sort of working with. They all want psychologically safe teams. But what does that actually look like? It looks like a team that is able to sit with conflict and be more resilient to it and hear perspectives that, they really don't like. Psychologically safe teams are not teams that always feel soft and cuddly and sort of fluffy.
They're not bubble wrapped.
They're not bubble wrapped. So it's like, it's careful what you wish for in inverted commas, but it's like the reality is that it is uncomfortable. Exactly what you're saying. Both of you are saying is that we need to notice that we find it very, very difficult, have a really strong rationale for it because, it can be really hard work. In couples therapy, it's often, well, what you guys are doing is not working. And what you're really hoping to get is more connection and more understanding. And the incredible piece that I'm always struck by is that when we sit with the discomfort of listening to somebody, really from that curious perspective and that openness that I want to know more about what unfolds, like you have some great examples in the book, what unfolds is something beautiful and you did not expect it. I didn't expect it. Like I learn as I'm sitting there listening to their perspectives and their version of the world. And the Gottmans talk about the dreams within conflict, which is that behind every stuck, gridlocked conversation is a dream. It's a longing. I long to, travel the world versus I long to feel financially secure. And, and that can create a lot of conflict. But we don't hear the dream. We don't understand our partner. And I think that is, extends to parenting, extends to leadership, is that ability to sit long enough to understand what lies beneath this moment, this conflict. And you had some great examples in the book around, incredibly polarized positions. I know you spoke about, the situation in the Middle East, and wow, that can really happen. But we need to sit there long enough and be authentic in our desire to listen in order to get there.
Can we talk about name, explore, and commit?
Sure.
The short
I can take
version.
a quick crack at this three-part framework. So for the name piece, this is the first part of the book. I think it's the part of the book that invites us to do an inward look. So when we say name, it's really naming our own internal conflicts, the sides of ourselves maybe that want to raise something and think it's important or think it's worthy, and maybe the sides that think I should just drop it, or I'm not sure, or it's selfish. But finding ways to name those and the underlying interests around them, and then trying to understand what might be going on for that other person or persons. The second part of the book is what we call explore. I would say this part of the book is probably the part that is the most kind of skills oriented, but it is how do we begin entering into the conflict? What do we say? What are the skills of curious and deep listening and effective assertion? And how would you open and frame and have these hard conversations? And then the last part of the book is what we call commit. And by commit, we mean a number of things. We talk a little bit about how do you commit to a process of working with the other, but also how do you make decisions of either, in some cases, let's reach an agreement or a resolution. In other cases, maybe we're going to continue in our disagreement, but decide to commit to an ongoing relationship, or decide to walk away from the relationship. And at times that is easier than others, right? If it's a friendship, it won't be easy, but you can do it. If it's a job, you might not be able to do it immediately, but you could start the process of looking for a new job. If it's your sibling, you could put some boundaries up, but you may have to interact with them at least in some limited ways. But we kind of try to offer some prescription there. And in particular, I think in that part of the book, because we really want to be clear not to confuse conflict resilience from subjecting yourself to harm or trauma or abuse. And so we offer the readers some diagnostic questions to help them sift through what is discomfort, which we are inviting people to, and what is like, no, this is like actually trauma or abuse, and you should exit from that.
Yep. And then there's actually a secret step. You might call it the dirty little secret step, which is before all these steps is just to pause and take a breath. That pause and the breath really helps to kind of regulate and bring back online these kind of frontal parietal systems, or deliberative thinking, strategic thinking systems that make it much more possible to be able to do the subsequent steps of naming, exploring, and committing. And the other thing that I'll just say here is, these steps, they are not something that you or anybody will master just by hearing about. Like, it's going to take practice and repetition. And we kind of compare it a lot like going to a gym, right? You don't go to a gym and just start lifting the heaviest weight. You don't do it doing like the power squatting or power lifting, whatever it is, because that's the easiest way to get hurt. You want to start with the lowest weights, really get your form down right, and do repetitions to build that muscle, because that's what will allow you to kind of avoid injury and lift heavier weight. And I think it's similar here, where as you're engaging in different conflicts, really be aware of how much distress you're experiencing with the conflicts. And if you were to give a number to it, like use these kind of subjective units of distress, like SUDS, like from 0 to 10, like no distress at all, 10 being like the worst distress possible. We want people to really focus in on the stretch zone of like that 4 to 6 range, to really bring these tools in to really build kind of that brain muscle of conflict resilience.
All right. Thank you so much. Hopefully our listeners will pick up the book, read it, and then put it to work, build the skills, and be resilient.
Yes.
Well, thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, I love this conversation. It's such a great topic, so important. And I really do think it's a real bridge to creating more connected communities and societies. I really do hope people pick up this book and put it into practice and recognize how difficult conflict is, and that it doesn't need to be like that. Like, we can get better at this, and that, we have a problem we need to address. So thank you for writing this. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having us. This is really fun.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets, or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.